morning, Ms. Richards.
Good morning, sir. So yesterday we were looking at documents relating to product usage and treatment policies. Before I complete that topic, I have been asked to confirm the period when Dr. Jones was chair of the Home Treatment Working Party of UKHCDO. And from UKHCDO records, it appears he held that role from 1978 to 1982. In terms then of product usage and treatment policies, the use of commercial concentrates in the course of the 1970s and 1980s, and to a lesser extent NHS factor concentrates, is clear from the documentation we looked at yesterday. The position in terms of the actual treatment for mild or moderate haemophiliacs or previously untreated patients, it is not entirely clear from the documents or from Dr. Jones's statements. And there is certainly evidence from individual witness statements of patients or family members that patients with mild haemophilia were on some occasions at least treated with factor concentrates, including commercial concentrates. And my attention has also been drawn by call participants to the case of 2 mild haemophiliacs and previously untreated patients who were treated in Newcastle with factor VIII concentrates in accident and emergency, which obviously raises questions about whether the scheme of comprehensive care and attempting to avoid A&E treatment was fully successfully implemented. Having looked at the contemporaneous or near contemporaneous documents yesterday, sir, I'm going to draw attention now to what Dr. Jones has said in later statements, starting with the document entitled Personal Record, which, as we understand it, was prepared in the course of or for the purposes of the HIV litigation. Shomik, that is WITN 0841007, please. You'll see, sir, it's headed Personal Record, Peter Jones. It's structured largely chronologically, and much of what is said in the first few pages is in fact really covered in the documents that we looked at yesterday. If we turn to page 6, however, we can see in the second paragraph, Dr. Jones referring to difficulties experienced in obtaining sufficient factor VIII concentrate for the treatment of haemophilia, in particular for the implementation of home therapy. And he talks about helping the medical correspondent of the Yorkshire Post construct a series of articles in 1975 in relation to that issue. If we then move on to page 12, and we pick up the second half of the page, the second paragraph, you will see here that Dr. Jones refers to his 1979 report to the Health Authority. We looked yesterday, sir, at the 1975 and 1977 reports, which Dr. Jones has provided to the inquiry. We don't have a copy, at least at present, of the 1979 report, and so that's why I'm taking Dr. Jones' account of it from here. He refers there to prophylaxis having an effect on the average number of factor VIII units per patient per year, but figures still in keeping with UK statistics. 59% of all the concentrate being used in 1978 was imported, i.e. commercial concentrates. And then if we go to the top of the next page, Dr. Jones tells us in the first paragraph that this 1979 report to the Health Authority concluded there is no hope that in the foreseeable future we will become less reliant on commercial concentrates. Dr. Lane, the new director of the Blood Products Laboratory in Elstree, last month reported to the Haemophilia Centre directors of the UK that without a government investment of £25 million, it would not be possible to increase capacity. It is also salient to note that we, and that I think is a we referring to Newcastle, have deliberately revised our policy of recommending that region only buy the most refined high purity products, and we now bargain for the lowest price for any product approved by the DHSS from any manufacturer. And it may be, sir, that may in part at least explain why, from those tables we looked at yesterday and elsewhere, we see a range of different commercial concentrates being used as the years go by, rather than simply the initial Travenol product that was preferred by Newcastle. That's the draft personal record. If we could next go to Dr. Jones's testimony to the Lindsay inquiry, LIND 40312, please. And could we turn to page 74? We can see almost halfway down the page a question being asked by Mr. Bradley. He says, we're talking about treatment options for the period 1980 to 85, and we mentioned the various treatment options that were available to you in Newcastle for that period. And then the question is asked, in priority, in terms of safety, what particular treatment options were pursued? And this was Dr. Jones's answer. We considered that the safest material available to us locally was our cryoprecipitate. That was certainly before AIDS. It was less likely to be associated with hepatitis than the pooled products for reasons that have already been discussed at length. It was also thought to be safer because of the population from the northern region that it was drawn from. Secondly, the National Health Service product was considered to be safe really for the same reasons, because of the population of our voluntary donors. But we were not given the luxury of being able to use that because there was insufficient material. Now, thirdly, the licensed commercial products, which had been first licensed in 1973, and of those there was very little to choose between them. They were all drawn from commercial donors. We had looked, by way of completeness, at getting volunteer donor plasma products from other sources, but again, that was impossible because of the paucities of supply, so those were the treatment options open to us prior to HIV. The question of heat treatment and other treatments of products were under clinical trial. And in respect of hepatitis, we were aware by the time that AIDS was with us that the early heat treatment drought had not succeeded in removing what was then known as non-A, non-B hepatitis, and that's why they weren't more generally in use by the time AIDS came along. And then if we turn to page 91, here Dr. Jones was questioned by Mr. Finlay about the treatment of children. If we could zoom in on the top half of the page, please, Shomik. Dr. Jones, can I ask you about the question of the treatment of children, the treatment which you prescribed for children? I think you described yesterday that for very young children, you would have prescribed cryoprecipitate. Answer, that's correct, yes. And then I think, correct me if I'm wrong about this, did you say that at the age of 6 approximately, the children would have been changed from cryoprecipitate, which had to be administered in hospital, to home treatment, which would have been on concentrate? Yes. And would that have been either NHS or concentrate or commercial concentrate, with a preference for NHS concentrate if available? Answer, if available, yes. And from what time would that have been your policy? When would that policy have first been adopted by you in the centre? Answer, in the 1970s. Yes, and would that policy have been continued up until, say, 1985? Answer, yes. And so even after 1983, would children, as they came to the age of approximately 6, have continued to be transferred from cryoprecipitate to concentrate? Answer, yes, of course, with the permission of the parents. And then I should, I think, perhaps probably complete the page. There's then a discussion about the logistics of keeping cryoprecipitate in deep freezes. And then the question is, from 1983 onwards, Dr. Jones, when the risk of AIDS, I think certainly by the middle to the end of 1983, it was something which would have been causing concern to you. Isn't that correct? Answer, it was, yes. And then he says, from that time onwards, Dr. Jones, from that time onwards, did you consider keeping the children who had been treated with cryoprecipitate, maintaining them on cryoprecipitate in order to avoid the risks which would come from home treatment and concentrates? And the answer is, indeed, we discussed that very carefully, yes. And then he says this, then the youngest child who had become infected in my centre was 7 years old. We had none, as Mr. Bradley pointed out earlier, below the age of 4. We had none below the age of 7, actually. And the reason that he was infected was that he had particular bleeds and severity of bleeds, and we started him on home therapy early. Pausing there, we can see from the fact that the youngest child who became infected in the centre was 7 years old. The inference I think we can safely draw from this evidence is that as a result of the transfer from cryoprecipitate to concentrate. In answer to the last question, it seems Dr. Jones is saying he considered and discussed, he doesn't say with whom, the question of maintaining children on cryoprecipitate. But the evidence does not suggest, indeed it is to the contrary, that that was a policy that was implemented. And if we
it does show or suggest that the Newcastle experience, at any rate, was that those children who had had cryoprecipitate, however severe their haemophilia may have been, did not succumb to the virus which caused AIDS.
Precisely.
And the reason given, I think, at the bottom of the page, actually, is set out there, isn't it, for the 7-year-old. He was started on home therapy earlier, and home therapy in Newcastle implied the use of concentrate, probably commercial.
Yes, precisely. And if we go over the page, the evidence is not entirely clear. The question is, so the policy remained in place that a child would start on cryo, but at the age of 6 approximately would move to concentrates. Answer, yes, if he was starting on home therapy. Question, and that remained in place even after 1983. Answer, yes, it did. And then he says, you asked me to this morning about the heat treatment in the cryoprecipitate, and my memory is that we still kept the children on cryo at that time because we thought it was a safer material, and we changed to the heat-treated concentrates for the patients who were receiving concentrate. Now, that seems to suggest a maintenance of cryoprecipitate rather than a switch to concentrates, but the answers given earlier seem to indicate clearly that the pre-existing policy of a switch to concentrates at the age of about 6 continued. And then there's a question, what you've mentioned is that even within that policy of having children on cryo up to approximately the age of 6, there might be clinical reasons why it would be necessary to depart from that in particular instances. Answer, yes. And then it goes on to talk about the treatments after heat-treated products became available, which I'm going to come on to heat treatment at a later stage. And then just to complete the relevant extracts from the Lindsay tribunal testimony, if we go to the next page, please, Shomik, page 93. We can see here what the treatment policy was in relation to Hemophilia B. The question a few lines down is, can we turn to Hemophilia B patients for a moment? What was the policy for children who had Hemophilia B? Were they given fresh frozen plasma or factor 9 concentrate? If we take the period, say, from 78 to 85, what would have been the policy? Answer, fresh frozen plasma is a very difficult material, yes. And it's difficult because whereas with cryoprecipitate, which contains factor 8, you can achieve a very good level of factor 9 after a relatively small volume of cryoprecipitate. Factor 8, sorry, after a relatively small volume of cryoprecipitate. With fresh frozen plasma, you have to give a big volume of the material in order to raise the factor 9 level. And he goes on to talk about potential difficulties there. and concludes there are very real medical reasons for trying to avoid the use of fresh frozen plasma as much as possible in haemophilia B patients. And then he continues, the second reason for us adopting factor 9 concentrate was that the UK was self-sufficient in factor 9 concentrate. And then he says we were able throughout to use NHS factor 9, and that in retrospect is why we didn't have any infection. So that's Dr. Jones to Lindsay. And then I should turn to his statements to the inquiry, of which there are two general statements. Shomik, the first is WITN 0841005, please. Could we go to page 3? And you'll see, Serho, I'm going to pick it up at the bottom of the page in response to question 8, that somewhat terse responses that are given to some of the questions. So a question, what decisions and actions were taken, what policies were formulated by you and the Centre regarding importation, manufacture and use of blood products? Answer, all products used had to be licensed, with the exception of FIBA. Which wasn't necessarily the question being asked. Over the page, question 9, he was asked about how decisions were taken in relation to the selection and purchase of blood products and what decisions were taken. Answer, decisions on selection and purchase of blood products were made annually at a meeting attended by the director or co-director, member of the nursing staff, a member of pharmacy and a patient representative. And then in answer to the question, what were the reasons or considerations that led to the choice of one product over another, it's briefly stated, choice depended on safety, efficacy, availability, price. In response to a question about any influence of the relationship with pharmaceutical companies, question 10, he asserts there was no formal relationship and no influence allowed, all transactions were transparent. And then if we go to the next page, please, Shomik. In answer to the question, how did you decide which products to use for particular patients, he simply says, as above, throughout the year, all patients being treated were followed up. Only patients with inhibitors to factor 8 received different treatment. And then at question 14, he was asked about the advantages and disadvantages of alternatives to factor concentrates and what use were made of them and whether they should have been used in preference to concentrates. Rather than answering that question, Dr. Jones set out, in fact, what he regarded as the advantages of factor concentrates. And we've seen those advantages in some of the documentation he authored at the time. If we go over the page, question 15. He was asked about the approach as regards the use of cryoprecipitate and says it was the treatment of choice until 1973 when sufficient factor 8 concentrate, which we know was commercial, became available. He described shortly in response to question 16 that prophylactic treatment was encouraged to some extent. And then he explains in relation to the use of concentrates for children at question 17. We can just go down the page slightly. Children were started on concentrates rather than cryoprecipitate in order to allow unfettered schooling, but then explains how, with the advent of HIV infection, cryoprecipitate was again prescribed in preference to concentrates. I think that's from 1985 onwards. And then if we go to the next page, question 19, he's asked to what extent and why were people with mild or moderate bleeding disorders treated with factor concentrates, and simply answered, depended on the clinical indication. For instance, severe bleeds or dental extraction / surgery. Concentrates were used until the introduction of DDAVP for Hemophilia A patients. So there appears to be a suggestion there that concentrates were, well, an acceptance that concentrates were used for people with mild or moderate bleeding disorders, dependent upon the clinical indication. Doesn't tell us when DDAVP was introduced into Newcastle as opposed to when it became available nationally.
If we can just go back for a moment to question 15.
Top of the previous page, Shomik.
And it's 17, it is further on down. Children were started on concentrates. Does he in any place define the age of the child?
No, well, I'll show you his second statement, so when he's asked some further questions about this. There are references to children in the contemporaneous documents to children under the age of 6.
Yes, I've seen that. That's why I'm asking.
Oh, you mean the upper age, sir? Or?
Because if it's over 6, then it could be reconciled with the earlier observations which he made to Lindsay in particular about children under 6 being kept on cryoprecipitate.
Well, I'll show you Dr. Jones's second statement, sir, because that is addressed again. There is a reference to in another document to the cut-off ages that were being under 4, which is why he was asked about it further. So if we go to the second statement, WITN 0841038. If we turn to page 4, please, first of all, Shomik. He was asked further questions about the annual meetings, which his first statement referred to, which decisions were taken about what products to use. Were they minuted? No. Was there a written policy setting out the process? No. Who presented the information? I was the lead presenter. I provided information on safety, efficacy, availability and price. Those present added to their knowledge, to this knowledge. He then refers to the role of the patient representative there to give first-hand feedback on choice and use of products used for home therapy and fed back any comments on inpatient team, and explains that was usually a member of the northern branch of the Haemophilia Society. If we go to the next page, he says the concerns are raised by the patient representative in relation to safety of factor concentrates, especially with regard to AIDS. He then says he tried to ensure that everyone, including patients, had up-to-date information on HIV infection, and I'll come back to that because that's not consistent with the statements that the inquiry has received from patients. And then in response to question G, he says that the issue of imported versus NHS factor concentrates was always part of the discussion. There were usually 2 main items: scarcity of the NHS concentrate and presentation of the NHS concentrate. The latter occurred because in the early days the NHS concentrate was more bulky and harder to prepare. And then if we go over the page, going to subparagraph M, he was asked about what discussions took place about whether imported factor concentrates should be used. He said there were discussions at every meeting. They always included knowledge of safety, efficacy, availability and cost. But what the perceptions were of knowledge, safety, efficacy, availability and cost are not there set out.
Well, he did say in answer to his earlier question that he was the one who provided the information about that.
Yes, precisely. And then if we go to page 8, he was asked to describe in more detail what he meant by consideration of safety, efficacy, availability and cost. In relation to safety, and in response to the question posed, which is what factors were relevant to the safety of a product in the context of these annual meetings, He says sterility and asepsis during preparation and intravenous injection of product, source of product, licensing of product, experience in-house and from other practitioners. Where did you obtain your information? Experience of other practitioners, product leaflets, published work. How important was the risk of a blood-borne virus? And he was asked the question, please set out precisely what you considered to be relevant to your decision-making, but the answer is simply always important, both to staff and patients. He then... Sorry, sir.
It doesn't really answer the question.
No. And then as to efficacy, he was asked again to give more detail about that. He says the factors were whether it worked or not, ease of preparation and delivery, cessation of bleeding, no short-term side effects. And again says he obtained information about efficacy from experience, published work, measurement of clotting in the laboratory. Next page, please, Shomik. In terms of availability, he was asked what factors were considered, supply and price. For instance, if NHS concentrates were unavailable, choice was reduced to imported material for the majority of patients. Where did you obtain your information as to the availability of a product directly from the companies, including BPL? And then he refers to there being continuing shortfall in NHS material. And then price, he says this, given safety, efficacy and availability being equal, and that is presumably as between commercial concentrates, given what he said earlier, but that's speculation perhaps, cost became an important factor in making a decision. And then the question was there ever a discussion that a more expensive product should be used because it was safer? And he said that occurred with the mid-80s regarding the prescription of heat-treated concentrates, which we'll come on to later. And then if we go to I think page 13, Shomik. Yes, well, actually, just pick up the bottom of page 12. And we see the question at the bottom of page 12 was, please now provide full and specific information about the products used for each blood disorder in a chronological account in the 1970s and 80s up to and including 1988 in relation to severe haemophilia A. And then he simply refers back to a document that we looked at yesterday in answer to the first question, so I won't return to that. Why were those products chosen? Products were chosen in the knowledge that there continued to be a shortfall in the supply of NHS concentrate. And then he's asked about something in his personal record, the document we looked at a few moments ago, where he said in 77 he chose not to change patients from haemophil to coate because he was reluctant to expose patients to another plasma pool from a different population of paid donors. So that's a keeping on one concentrate type of approach. And says, I was aware that the larger the donor pool, the greater the likelihood of possible exposure to a pathogen. It seemed sensible at the time to try to limit this exposure. So just pausing there, again, the evidence that the inquiry has received so far from individual patients does not indicate any kind of consistent policy of keeping to one concentrate. And we know, of course, from the returns and other documents that a range of different commercial concentrates were used in the 80s. But we've seen individual records which indicate individual patients receiving a range of different commercial concentrates rather than being kept on one. And then in answer to the question, why were commercial concentrates used in preference to NHS, he simply says because shortfall in NHS supply, choice continued to be limited. If we go over the page to the bottom of page 14, he was asked about mild haemophilia A and the treatment of patients with mild haemophilia A, and said the decision on which product to use depended on the underlying factor level and the condition requiring treatment. Rarely, if ever, I cannot recall details of concentrate was prescribed. So we've certainly seen cases, and I'll look at some information in relation to that later, of patients with mild haemophilia receiving concentrates. And this would have been NHS concentrate. When it became available, DDAVP could be useful. So again, that doesn't tell us when DDAVP began to be used in Newcastle. Why were those products chosen? Answer, less likely to have side effects. And then in answer to the question, well, he's asked the question, what safety and risk analysis was carried out, whether informally or formally. His answer is as set out above. What consideration was given to, what use was made of cryoprecipitate? It broadly states cryoprecipitate was used, the extent of that and the criteria not set out. So that's in relation to mild haemophilia. He confirms, if we go over the page in relation to, on page 16, he confirms, first of all, in relation to Hemophilia B, what we saw from the Lindsay evidence that factor 9 concentrate fractionated by the NHS was used. In relation to von Willebrand disease, he says, in answer to question 12, cryoprecipitate was usually the product of choice after consideration of DDAVP. And then if we go to page 17, it's pointed out to him that he hadn't answered the question in the previous statement, and he's asked now to respond. So he's asked what were the disadvantages of factor concentrates, having only set out the advantages in his first statement. And he says disadvantages of factor concentrates were either short or long-term. Short-term side effects included allergic reactions, and especially with factor 9 concentrates, thrombosis. Long-term advantages included transmission of pathogens, including hepatitis. Disadvantages included transmission of pathogens, including hepatitis and HIV. And then he refers to the 5th edition of his book, which is obviously a much later edition. What were the advantages of the alternative treatments? Most alternative treatments, so most alternatives to concentrates, avoided the risk of transmission of pathogens. And then over the page, he's asked why he hadn't in his earlier statement referred to DDAVP, and he can't recall why. And then he's asked to set out the advantages and disadvantages of DDAVP. I think we've heard those discussed by earlier clinicians. At paragraph 15D, he says how many patients were offered DDAVP instead of factor concentrates. He says patients with mild to moderate factor VIII deficiency and those with von Willebrand's, but can't remember exact numbers. He's asked to what extent did you use DDAVP, over what period and for which categories of patient, and he just says, as explained above, DDAVP became the treatment of choice for susceptible patients. So again, it doesn't tell us the period. He goes on in his statement to say, and this is something I'll come back to later, that full information and all available information was openly explained and discussed with patients and their families. And again, the evidence the inquiries received from patients and their families is to the contrary. If we then go to page 21, please, Shomik. If we zoom in on the top half of the page, he's asked about what he said in his earlier statement, that it was best practice to treat children under 6 with cryoprecipitate. And he's asked about what he said in his book, AIDS in the Blood, when he said the recommendation was for cryoprecipitate to be given to children under 4. And he said he can't explain the discrepancy except to say he was trying to cover the youngest children. But the contemporaneous documents do suggest that 6 was the usual age that was worked to for the transfer onto concentrates. Why was it best practice? Answer, because it was best practice. Locally sourced cryoprecipitate was considered safer than concentrates at the time. In terms of, he's asked about the disadvantages of using factor concentrates on children. The answer is possibly more chance of pathogen transfer. He's asked what infections were of particular concern and why. Hepatitis, although he goes on to assert that the incidence was approximately the same in multi-transfused patients treated with either cryoprecipitate or concentrate. And then the question is asked, why was that not a concern after a child was age 6? And he answers this, of course those are the risks of bloodborne infections, were always a concern, but at that time a minor one, especially in the context of the management of bleeds. And then he was asked just to complete the picture in relation to DDAVP, question 21, bottom of page 22. He's referred to his first statement where he said that concentrates were used for haemophilia A patients prior to the introduction of DDAVP. This is mild or moderate patients. And the question's asked, why not use cryoprecipitate? And then over the page, what he says is, in general, concentrates were used as cryoprecipitate was phased out. Depending on the circumstances, severity of bleeding / clinical need, all options were open, including the use of cryoprecipitate. DDAVP was used instead of blood products when indicated. So that's Dr. Jones's evidence in his statements to the inquiry, sir, about his approach to the use of blood products, and you'll no doubt wish to consider those in due course.
So, just going back to the question which took you to this statement at this stage, when he uses the word children receiving concentrates, he's talking most probably, given putting those two together, this statement and that one, about children who are over the age of 6. So there's older children, still technically children, but not the youngest age group. That would be the reconciliation, I think.
Yes, I think it would. Whether it's over the age of 6 or 6 and over, different terminology is used in different places.
Yes.
But the policy certainly was at around the age of 6 to move from the use of cryoprecipitate to the use of concentrates.
I mean, query why the number 4 comes in, but he can't explain that. But no. He used. Yes, thank you.
So, going to turn to look now at what the documentation tells us about the Newcastle centres, and in particular Dr. Jones' knowledge of hepatitis, and then I'll turn to HIV and AIDS. We've touched on that obviously in some of the documents we've seen so far, and I'm not proposing to revisit the documents we've already looked at. In terms of looking at journals and keeping up to date, Dr. Jones has said in his statement he maintained his knowledge in the field by reading the BMJ, British Medical Journal, the Lancet, the Archives of Disease in Children, and the British Journal of Haematology and Hospital Medicine. We know that Dr. Jones was a regular attender at Haemophilia Centre Director meetings, and in relation to reference centre director meetings, usually either he attended or Dr. Hamilton as co-director attended. So he would have received, or Dr. Hamilton would have received, the reports of, for example, the Hepatitis Working Party, the reports of Dr. Krask, and, of course, the minutes of the reference centre director meetings, at which there were discussions over the years on a number of issues relating to hepatitis. If we just go to one document, PJON 606_032. We can see this is a letter, 25th of April 1978. It's from Dr. Jones to a Dr. Seligson at the Veterans Administration Hospital in San Diego. And the context of the discussion is that Dr. Jones was asked to set up a series of seminars or symposia in the course of 1979 on hepatitis. And we can see, if we look at it in the second paragraph, he says, we thought that we should build up the general picture of liver disease due to transfusion rather than simply concentrate on haemophilia. To this end, I'm writing to Zuckerman in London, Hoofnagel in Bethesda, Hadzianis in Athens, Williams in London, and Roberts in Chapel Hill. The latter is already heading one of your other symposia, but as he probably has more experience of liver biopsy and haemophilia than anyone else, I don't think he will mind being invited to do some extra work. So I draw attention to that just to indicate that whilst some of the particular journals that we've looked at when considering the knowledge of risk on non-A, non-B hepatitis may not be journals that would typically be read by haemophilia clinicians. We can see from this that Dr. Jones clearly has knowledge of the expertise of leaders in the field. We've obviously looked at publications by both Zuckerman and Hufnagel. So he may be thought to have been up to speed to some extent with latest developments. If we then start by looking at Dr. Jones's own 1974 publication, Living with Haemophilia, so it should, I think, be HSOC 0019621. So if we go to the next page. Keep going. Next page, we should have the dates just to show what edition we're looking at. Yes, bottom of the page. So we'll see that this is the first edition published in 1974. The second edition was not published until 1984, I think it is. It certainly wasn't earlier than 1984. And so for a key period from 74 through to 84, this would have been what was available to any patients who were provided with this book, and we've heard from other clinicians that some of them did provide this book to their patients. Shemik, I want to go to, it's numbered page 78. Looking at the pagination at the bottom of the page, so if you perhaps try page 80 electronically, and we'll see where that takes us to. We go on 2 further pages. We can see there at the bottom half of the page the heading hepatitis. I should say in the context of what patients might reasonably expect to read and understand. This is a full-size book. It's not a pamphlet or leaflet. It runs to some 178 or so pages. This is the section on hepatitis. It says this: one of the rare but important side effects of blood transfusion is serum hepatitis. In this disorder, the liver becomes inflamed and no longer able to remove a naturally occurring pigment from the bloodstream. The build-up in pigment results in jaundice with a characteristic yellow coloration of skin and the whites of the eyes. The urine becomes darker, and because pigment is no longer being excreted from the liver from the bile, the feces become pale. Serum hepatitis is caused by a virus. The disease is spread by the direct introduction of virus present in the blood from one person into the bloodstream of another. This may happen during the transfusion of blood or through cuts on the hands of staff handling blood products. Because the virus is a foreign invader of the body, it acts as an antigen, and the recipient reacts by producing antibody against it. The serum hepatitis antigen is known either as the Australia antigen, because it was first discovered in 1965 in the blood of an Australian Aborigine, or as the hepatitis-associated antigen, HAA. The antigen and antibody can be detected by special laboratory tests, and all blood is now screened for the antigen before being issued for use. As an additional precaution, no one who's had jaundice is accepted as a blood donor. The effect of the virus depends on its virulence and on the resistance of the recipient. Hemophiliacs seem to have a high resistance, probably developed as a result of repeated blood transfusions. Although many have the antibody, few have had severe jaundice due to serum hepatitis. In the unlikely event of, top of the next page, jaundice affecting a haemophiliac, it's obviously very important to establish the cause. Blood must be tested for the presence of the antigen, and if it's present, its source must be determined. And then he refers to the incubation period. And then in the next paragraph says this: with all the precautions, serum hepatitis is nowadays a rare cause of jaundice, and it is far more likely that the patient presenting with jaundice has infectious hepatitis, which is spread by contact like influenza. Anyone with either type of hepatitis in hospital will find themselves being barrier nursed to prevent spread to other patients and members of staff. Now, this then is what patients would have had available to them from this book for a decade or so, from 74 to 84. And it's tolerably clear, I think, that what Dr. Jones is talking about here is solely hepatitis B, perhaps unsurprisingly given it was published in 1974, but clearly this contains no information in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis.
What may be interesting is what he describes as the go back page.
Previous page, Shomik. Sorry, previous page, page 78. If we zoom in on the bottom half of the page.
Yep. As an additional precaution, this is the last sentence of the penultimate paragraph. As an additional precaution, no one who has had jaundice is accepted as a blood donor. This particular publication, diagrams in it, we were told, I caught my eye as you passed over it, were done by somebody from Travenol. And this would perhaps suggest that the information available to Dr. Jones was that at the time, everyone who gave their blood to Travenol for making into a factor product would actually have been asked about jaundice and only accepted if they said they'd never had it.
Yes, that may be one inference. You're right, so line drawings by Doreen Lang of Travenol Laboratories, it says in one of the early pages of the book. Yes, of course, where he says as an additional precaution, no one who's had jaundice is accepted as a blood donor, he doesn't identify which jurisdiction he's talking about, UK, US or elsewhere.
And it also assumes, in the same vein, that the blood taken for making into a product is screened for the antigen, which is assuming a knowledge of American practice, insofar as it's talking about American concentrate.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
So that's Dr. Jones' own book. We can see from some other documents that he had a particular concern at that time about hepatitis B. If we go to PJON 4043 _ 001, Shomik. I'm hoping that's the right reference anyway. PJON, I'm so sorry, 5 zeros, 44 _ 001. My apologies. So this is correspondence between Dr. Jones and the DHSS Medicines Division about a particular concern regarding hepatitis B in 1974. So the letters that we don't have the full set of correspondence, but this refers to a letter that Dr. Jones had written to Dr. Krask regarding a patient and the probable contamination of a batch with hepatitis B antigen. And then in the next sentence, Dr. Holgate from the DHSS says, as I'm sure you're aware, the current tests, much to the regret of any licensing, the current tests do not, much to the regret of any licensing authority, yield clear-cut, black and white, positive/negative answers. Instead, as might be expected when batches of material are obtained from pools of donors, one obtains a range of antigenic content and has to select some arbitrary level beyond which the batch is classified as positive and not to be distributed. We may be working at too high a level at present, but all this is still very much in the development stages, and therefore we're extremely grateful to obtain any feedback information. And then Dr. Holgate puts forward a proposal. I am at present wondering whether we might not be of greater assistance to the user of this type of material if we could establish some mechanism whereby we could let the user know the degree of positivity of the various tests through which the product has been put. In this way, it would seem to me possible that the user could select cases to receive appropriate batches, always assuming he has any choice. The user here is clearly the clinician, not the patient. Thus, if the user had in his stocks a batch known to be fairly high in the range of positive test and another fairly low, he could select appropriate cases to receive such batches with a slightly higher degree of safety. The whole position is extremely difficult since the material is itself so valuable. One could very easily say that one is not going to accept any batch with any sign of positivity at all, in which case we would probably get none at all. I'd be very glad to hear your views. And in Dr. Jones's response, which is PJ0N, PJON 5043_001. Dr. Jones responded on the 18th of September 1974 to Dr. Holgate and says this: as you intimate in your letter, I find the whole question of contamination with hepatitis B very worrying. Just pausing there, so you've seen the message about hepatitis B set out in the same year in Dr. Jones's book. This is what's being said to the DHSS. Not the least of the difficulties concerns the risk to the staff, and I think it would be most useful to have some sort of policy, preferably with insurance covered, laid down by the department. At present, the procedure among staff seems to vary from unit to unit. Some are tested regularly, some never. Some receive frequent gamma globulin, some don't bother. A particular concern is the question of operation on positive patients. We have a hip replacement to do in the near future, and although the orthopaedic surgeon feels morally obliged to proceed, there seem to be too few objective guidelines with which to weigh up the risk. And then, dealing with the proposal or the suggestion made by Dr. Holgate in his letter, Dr. Jones says, I think that it would be helpful for you to establish a system of informing us of the degree of positivity of the various tests. No doubt it would be very difficult to make up one's mind on individual cases, but in general I can foresee us using low batches on children and high batches on adults. I'm afraid that these comments are probably rather muddled, but there are so many loose ends it would be nice to think we could have as many of them as possible tied up on a national basis. And then the further letter from Dr. Holgate is at PJON 5045_001. Second of October 1974. Dr. Holgate says in the second paragraph, I must hastily withdraw from the problem outlined in your second paragraph concerning the safety of the staff, etc. This is a policy issue way above my pay level and buried no doubt somewhere deep in the elephant in Counsel. I'll certainly mention it whenever the opportunity arises. And then in the next paragraph, what I'm most grateful for is the encouragement you give in your third paragraph to our attempts to give you some indication of the degree of contamination, if any, of the various blood factors which may carry the antigen. We are still examining this problem because as soon as we think we have one adequate test method, changes occur in it and we need to look again. Once we have an adequate quantitative test method, then I think we would be in a position to label each batch of product with some notion, as you say, high or low, of the possible contamination. I'll keep you informed as to the progress of this idea. So that's correspondence we've received, provided to us by Dr. Jones in documents he's given to the inquiry. Whether the correspondence continued further, we've not seen certainly any further correspondence directly between Dr. Holgate and Dr. Jones on this issue.
I mean, what this is describing is akin to a pass mark approach, that you fail if you're, in this case, over the level, and pass if you're, in this case, under the level. And the level is described as a degree of positivity or a degree of contamination. Is it a matter for me ultimately to ask or wonder whether what has been described is the viral load of the product being tested?
Well, I think it's difficult to understand from this correspondence alone whether that's the case or not. It may be, or whether the idea gained any further traction. We'll need to pursue that in our investigations with the Department of Health and Social Security materials. But so yes, that may be the inference that you draw.
Because it can't quite be the same as sensitivity of a test, because that only identifies levels beyond a certain amount of viral load, that's my understanding. However, that's perhaps best to let the experts in due course.
Yes. So that was a discussion in 1974 about concerns regarding hepatitis B. We then moved with the next document to 1975 and a document authored by Dr. Jones, showing it's PJON 5047_001. You will see this is headed confidential, the factor VIII concentrates and hepatitis. And it's dated June 1975. We see that on the next page. He says this, at a meeting earlier this year, I indicated that there was an association between the incidence of hepatitis and the use of commercial factor VIII concentrates. I'm writing to tell you that this association has now been proved and that the virus has been identified in 2 of the batches of commercial concentrate tested at the Middlesex Hospital. Dr. Krask of Bournemouth has collected 45 cases of jaundice presumed to be due to commercial concentrate contamination. In Newcastle, we've now had 16 cases of jaundice in the past 18 months. 15 of these had received commercial concentrate and 10 had been on home therapy. 7 cases have been HAA positive, 4 on home therapy. We also have 1 case of carrier status persistent HAA positive who's never received concentrate. Of the 7 patients who become HAA positive, 3 have reverted to the negative state shortly after their illness, 2 are due for retesting, 2 have been notified within the past month. All these patients are severely affected haemophiliacs, all have been multi-transfused in the past. There have been no reports of jaundice in staff or in the relatives. The disease in our patients has been mild, only 1 boy has had to be admitted to hospital for a week. Although Hemophil is the product connected with the UK outbreak, it is quite obvious that all concentrate carries the risk, and that we can expect this risk to continue even when a UK product becomes generally available. The manufacturers of commercial concentrates have instituted very careful programmes of testing individual donors from whom plasma is collected by plasmapheresis, as well as the finished batches of material. As between 1,000 and 6,000 litres of material are fractionated at the same time, it is hardly surprising that the occasional virus gets through and that it's not picked up on routine testing because of the dilution factor. And then he goes on to talk in the bottom half of the page about a conference he attended arranged by Travenol Laboratories, manufacturers of Hemophil in London. He says Dr. Cleghorn, director of the blood transfusion service at Edgware General Hospital, was there. Dr. Dane, virologist at the Middlesex, Dr. Krask, and the medical director of Travenol USA. It was generally agreed that the advantages and indeed the necessity of concentrate outweighed the risk of hepatitis, particularly in severely affected multi-transfused haemophiliacs. Pausing there, of course, that begs the question explored in part with the ethicists last week, sir, of whose decision it is to determine if advantages outweigh risks. And then he says this, as a result of the meeting, the following recommendations are being made in order to limit as far as possible the incidence of hepatitis. Use of factor VIII concentrate should be confined to severely affected haemophiliacs and preferably to those haemophiliacs who have a history of frequent transfusion. Young children and mildly affected haemophiliacs should always receive cryoprecipitate in preference to concentrate, unless there is an overriding clinical reason for using concentrate, i.e. in the event of a severe bleed when cryo is not available, or for the treatment of factor VIII antibodies, or when home therapy is strongly indicated. 3, that Drs. Cleckhorn and Dane should explore the possibility of preparing immune plasma for use in a passive immunological protection programme. And then over the page, said it's hoped this programme can be got underway very quickly, etc. In view of this complication, can I ask everyone who uses commercial concentrate to make sure we receive full details, patient, reason for use, and most important, batch numbers, every time a factor VIII concentrate is used in the region? We would also obviously like notification of any cases of jaundice. Patients on the home therapy programme and all patients attending for follow-up in Newcastle are having routine liver function tests, and Australia antigen status determined already. The report of the Bournemouth outbreak by Dr. Krask has been accepted for publication in the BMJ and should be published in the near future. Now, just going back to the previous page, bottom of the previous page would appear to suggest a policy of using concentrates only for severely affected haemophiliacs, preferably those who have a history of frequent transfusion. So infrequently transfused or previously untreated patients on that analysis should not receive concentrates according to this policy. That doesn't appear to have been the policy that was then followed over the following years. And then you'll see young children and mildly affected haemophiliacs should always receive cryoprecipitate unless there's an overriding clinical reason for using concentrate. We've already discussed the question of what is a young child. It would appear to follow from this that, notwithstanding the risks identified in this document, children from 6 onwards would nonetheless or potentially start being treated with factor concentrates. And I've already indicated we have seen evidence in relation to some cases of mildly affected haemophiliacs being treated with commercial and NHS concentrates. That was Dr. Jones's confidential memorandum. It doesn't tell us who it's addressed to, but it may be reasonable to infer that it's for circulation to other clinicians in the northern region. It certainly reads that way. And just then, still in 1975, if we can go to OXUH 303735, please. These are the minutes of a Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting on the 21st of June, on the 18th of September 1975. Dr. Jones was present. If we go to page 9, we looked at this document yesterday in relation to what it said about home treatment. I want to look at it now in the context of hepatitis. Bottom half of the page, there's a heading, the proposed pilot study of hepatitis in haemophilic patients. It refers to Dr. Krask hoping to continue his study of hepatitis in patients who'd received haemophil. Dr. Kirk introduced a paper circulated at the meeting on a proposal to study the incidence of hepatitis in haemophilia patients who'd received material of known types. He was proposing as a pilot study to keep detailed records on the following patients. And then the first category are patients at Trelaw, 20 receiving cryo, 10 receiving cryoblin, 5 receiving Elstree factor 8, and obviously we'll be looking further at Trelaw later in the year. And then at Newcastle, 40 patients receiving haemophil, and then there's a reference to 15 patients at Oxford receiving Oxford factor 8 and 10 receiving haemophil. So a contemplated study of 40 patients at Newcastle who were receiving haemophil to study the incidence of hepatitis in such patients. The next document takes us to 1976, and of course we know that in December 1975 the World in Action broadcast was shown on television, and we've heard from some clinicians that they were not aware of it at the time. That's not the case in relation to Dr. Jones, as we shall see. HSOC 0021641, please. Shomik. This is the Haemophilia Society's Northumbrian branch newsletter from the spring of 1976. And if we go to page 3, there is an article in the newsletter authored by Peter Jones, and it's headed Hepatitis and the World in Action. Many of you will have been worried by the recent World in Action documentaries about haemophilia and hepatitis, and I know that these programmes cause particular concern to our friends with the young haemophilic children. I thought that I should therefore devote my contribution to this newsletter to a consideration of the programmes themselves and to a factual explanation of the present position. And then under the heading the programme, he says, we agreed to speak to the researcher for the World in Action on the understanding that the programme was to be devoted to an inquiry into the supply of and demand for anti-haemophilic globulin concentrates. A similar understanding was reached with the National Haemophilia Society, the officials of which were assured that the presentation would help them in their efforts to forward the treatment of haemophiliacs in the United Kingdom. Instead of this, the programme screen presented a dramatised account of the danger of hepatitis, which, by being taken out of context, was both biased and frightening. As you know, the interview filmed in Newcastle was totally cut, presumably because in it we tried to present the true picture without condemning a lot of hard-working and conscientious people who, through both the National Blood Transfusion Service and the commercial companies, are responsible for allowing us to implement the advances in haemophilia care of which you are all aware. It appears that a television documentary on the level of the World in Action depends more on drama than on informed discussion, presumably because it attracts more advertising revenue. So just pausing there, you will know, and many listening will know, that when the Mail on Sunday published an article about AIDS in 1983, Dr. Jones made a complaint about that article to the Press Council, which was in part upheld, and we'll look at that when we come on to consider the position in relation to AIDS. We see here, some 8 years before, Dr. Jones' reaction to a documentary drawing attention to issues relating to hepatitis and commercial concentrates. And then under the heading, The Facts, hepatitis is caused by a virus, a minute organism which attacks the liver. There are at least two types of viral hepatitis, known respectively as virus A and virus B. Hepatitis A is the same as infectious hepatitis and is spread like influenza in the community. And then the rest of the paragraph talks about hepatitis A. Next paragraph says, in contrast, the virus of hepatitis B has a long and variable incubation period, 40 to 180 days. Its method of spread is largely by inoculation of blood from a person carrying the virus in his or her bloodstream. Like hepatitis A, it may produce jaundice in a susceptible person and, underlined rarely, it may result in serious disease. It is important to realise that a person attacked by either virus will not necessarily develop jaundice. He may pass off the infection as flu or even feel no untoward effects. This is the reason why inquiries about donors' histories of jaundice will not effectively exclude all virus carriers. Perhaps neatly ties in with the observation you made, Sarah, about the sentence in Dr. Jones's book. And World in Action did not make this clear. As one doctor who watched the programme pointed out, hepatitis is respecter of neither alcoholic nor archbishop, but the blood of either may contain its virus without him being aware of it. If obvious jaundice has been experienced by a potential donor, however, it is at present routine to exclude him or her from a donor panel. For instance, I cannot give blood because I had jaundice as a child. Over the page, hepatitis and products for transfusion are both forms of hepatitis, A and B, and probably other types we have yet to discover may be transmitted from blood donor to blood recipient. The risk to the recipient obviously increased the more blood product he requires. If we consider a single treatment in the life of a haemophiliac, the potential risk becomes clear. And then he sets out a theoretical risk of transmission from FFP, a theoretical risk of transmission from cryoprecipitate, and then a significantly greater theoretical risk of transmission from concentrates. Of course, the actual risk will be much lower than these figures suggest, as only a very small proportion of donors may carry the virus. Testing for the virus. In previous newsletter, I explained how hepatitis B had been linked to the Australia antigen, and he then goes on to talk about that. And then he says two things have changed. Testing has become much more sensitive, and each donation is now tested. In addition, there is informal communication between paid donor plasma collection centres run by different commercial companies, and many undesirable donors who try to do the rounds in order to give more plasma than they should for profit are soon recognised and excluded. As a result of the increased sensitivity of tests for hepatitis B and the gradual exclusion of positive donors, plasma from paid sources in America is now said to be almost as safe as that from voluntary sources. This achievement has only taken 3 years, and we can expect further improvements in safety in the future. Why then did we see an outbreak of hepatitis in this country? For 2 reasons. Firstly, because the early batches of AHG from America had been tested by the less sensitive techniques then available. And secondly, because it was likely that the British population of haemophiliacs were more susceptible to hepatitis than their American brothers who'd been exposed to high-risk material from an early age. Finally, we must consider the moral question of where we obtain blood. In the perfect world everyone, including the commercial companies, would like blood to be donated freely by voluntary donors, as happens now in the United Kingdom. This attitude has been strongly supported by both the World Health Organization and the Red Cross. However, we do not live in a perfect world, and at the present time there is simply not enough voluntary plasma being fractionated to meet the rising demands of haemophiliacs and other patients whose health depends on a single blood product. If the day is reached when enough voluntary plasma is available in each country, we will be delighted. In the meantime, we are grateful for AHG concentrate, whatever the source. The flow of plasma in the world market does cross state boundaries, and people are right to be concerned about possible deprivation of underdeveloped countries in order to satisfy the demand of richer nations. However, the AHG concentrate we use is not from underdeveloped countries. The flow is from west to east and not from south to north, and we at present rely on North American blood donors in order to meet our needs. It may be sad that some people must give plasma in order to live, but the World in Action implication that their alcoholism or drug abuse can affect the AHG concentrate produced from their plasma is not true. As a result of the programme, some parents have been worried that their sons will become alcoholic or drug dependent because they've received haemophil. This is not possible. There are 2 morals to this story. 1, never believe everything you see on the box, particularly if it has been filmed and therefore open to skillful editing. 2, if you're ever frightened by something you hear or see regarding haemophilia, do not hesitate to ask us for the truth. If we can't answer your questions, we will try to refer you to someone who can. So you will note the tone of this, what are said to be the facts, and the absence in spring of 1976 of any reference at all to non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Well, he does talk. If you go back to the top of the previous page.
The closest we get, I think, is probably other types we have yet to discover.
That's it. And that is in the context of him identifying that both A and B can be tested for, and identified. And so that I think is probably, am I being too generous, is probably a reference to some speculation, as he would perhaps call it, in the press by this time, certainly well established, that there were other types which had not been identified as viruses specifically. Didn't know whether it was 1 or 2, but there certainly wasn't A, wasn't B, and it was causing hepatitis. But he doesn't quite go that far, does he?
No.
But I think that probably is a reference to the non-A, non-B.
And you will no doubt, yes, possibly, and you will no doubt wish to consider, Sarah, in due course, what the member of the Northumbrian branch of the Haemophilia Society would have thought reading this, what reassurance they may have gained about the safety of any product that was being used.
Yes, so they were being told that it had been tested. It came from sources which were safe, who'd been asked about jaundice, that the North American companies were almost as good and safe as UK sources, that the plasma they were using all came from the North Americans, that alcoholics and drug abusers, there was no reason to think that they created a community of any greater risk of hepatitis, and certainly didn't transmit alcohol and partiality for drugs. Yes, that's the tone of it, I think.
Yes.
So it's giving not so much reassurance as it is saying it's perfectly safe.
Yes.
In effect.
We then moved from 1976 to 1979, and I think perhaps I'll just do this document and then it may be convenient to break. Shamit, could we have PJON 602, please? In fact, we looked at this yesterday, so Shamit, I won't ask you to put it on screen. I'll just remind you, sir, and those who are listening, this was a reference to Dr. Jones's physician's guide to the treatment of haemophilia. It wasn't aimed at patients in any event, called Hemophilia Management from 1979, which talked about the greater risk from large donor pools of serum hepatitis and compared to cryoprecipitate. But in fact, we looked not only at what it said about home treatment, but also yesterday at what it said about hepatitis. So I won't go back over that. But still in 1979, that was the year in which Dr. Jones chaired the symposium at the 13th Congress of the World Federation of Hemophilia in Tel Aviv. We have various papers from that. I'm not going to go to those today. But if we could go to PJON 40158_001. This is entitled An Overview. It's by Dr. Jones. It's not clear what it's an overview to, but it would appear to arise out of or be related to that Congress of the World Federation of Haemophilia. He refers to it in the first paragraph. And then in the second paragraph, he says this: thanks to his colleagues engaged in research and in blood collection and fractionation, the clinician now has powerful tools with which to manage a chronic and painful disorder. But at what price? Is quality being bought at the expense of longevity? Is chronic hepatic damage really one of the expected side effects of intensive multi-donor transfusion? Or do we play with fears based on serological and histological findings with little relevance to clinical fact? If we are harming our patients, at what stage and by what means should we recognise this harm? And most important of all, can we treat if we cannot prevent liver damage in the haemophiliac? And then he refers to what I think are the published papers arising out of the symposium. And then if we go further down the page, Dr. Jones says this: the following thought-provoking presentations suggest a number of guidelines for future haemophilia management. It's evident that although the safeguards imposed since the outbreaks of hepatitis 6 years ago were welcome, the dangers of viral disease transmission inherent in intensive transfusion are far from over, and that these dangers are compounded by the use of large plasma pools from commercial sources. This is well recognised both by industry, which must continually upgrade its methods of donor selection, collection and surveillance, and by the voluntary blood donation organisations. It's perhaps less well recognised by those responsible for the finance, organisation and development of these voluntary organisations, and by some members of the medical profession who continue to advocate the use of whole blood. Although still ill-defined in terms of long-term effects, that's not the page I have. Is there one? Thank you. The risks also mean that all multi-transfused haemophiliacs must be followed closely, their general health as well as the control of their underlying disorder being monitored at regular intervals. He then goes on to discuss the issue of liver biopsies in the next paragraph. Then the last paragraph says this: in light of these arguments, it's interesting to note that neither the serological nor the abnormal biopsy findings reported in haemophilia seem to match the incidence of clinically apparent disease. And there's been no increase in the death rate from liver failure, even in those patients who've received numerous transmissions of commercial large pool blood product for over a decade. So while the answers to many of the above-mentioned questions will only become clear with time, perhaps the most important message to emerge from this survey is that although risks remain, they are probably of less consequence than might be suggested by the literature, and are certainly outweighed by the need to treat haemophilic bleeding in the only way we know, by the rapid replacement of the relevant clotting factor. And again, so that raises, as it were, the ethical question, the principles of which we debated last week, as to whose decision it is as to whether risks outweigh the advantages of treatment. So is that a convenient point at which to take a morning break?
Yes, it is. We'll come back then at 10 to 12.
Thank you, sir.
So 10 to 12.